Hello Bookstack, welcome back as we discuss chapters 8 and 9 of How to Read a Book. Hello Bookstackers, we're going to get started discussing chapter 8 of How to Read a Book called Coming to Terms with an Author. In short, he says that terms are basic elements of communicable knowledge. So a term is a word used unambiguously. As we know, words have several different meanings and they can be used several different ways. But if a writer and a reader are going to come to terms and they're going to communicate, they must be using the same words to mean the same things. Terms are basically skilled use of words to communicate knowledge. Now, when we talk about terms and the importance of terms and understanding them, we're basically talking about expository works because things like poetry and fiction, they're not so concerned with terms, and it's not really necessary for you to understand the one meaning of a word. In fact, most fiction and most poetry expects you to understand the multiple meanings that a word can have and the kind of the double entendres. They kind of rely on that. So you're not really looking for the one specific meaning that an author is trying to put into a single word. It's really not as important as it is when you're reading expository works. This leads us to rule number 5, which is to find the important words that an author is using and through them come to terms with an author. This rule basically has two parts. Number 1, you want to identify the words that are important. So as you're reading, you want to make sure that you're identifying those specific words that an author is going to use over and over again. It is going to be used specifically to communicate his main message. The second part of the rule is to determine the one meaning that the author is going after in using those specific words. In other words, to come to terms. Now this is the first rule for the second stage of analytical reading. Now the first stage was primarily concerned with the structure and the outline of a book. The second part of analytical reading is concerned with the contents and the interpretation of the meaning of the work itself. This is going to cause you to not only deal with the language itself, but to move beyond the language to the thought behind the language. In other words, why is this author using the specific words that he is? What's the thought and the reasoning behind it? Because language is imperfect as a medium for communicating knowledge, it also serves as an obstacle to communicating knowledge. And the success of communication using words and using terms depends on the willingness of not only the writer, but the reader to work together to understand each other. Now, each rule for analytical reading has two steps. One is grammatical and the other is logical. So not only are you wanting to understand the words, like we said, we're trying to get to those meanings and behind it, the thoughts behind the words to come to the terms, because language is used to communicate thoughts, and if there are no thoughts behind the language being used, then nothing is being communicated, knowledge is not being communicated. So it's very important that we go through the process and take the steps to understand the thoughts behind the words, because that specifically is what we're after, is the thought and the reasoning and the mind of the author. So we want to go through the process of actually finding the key words. Now, most authors are going to use most words in the ordinary way that most men use them. They're going to have multiple meanings, and it's not really important, but it's going to use some words in a special way. Now, if we're reading a modern author, it's not going to be that difficult to really get to the terms he's using and really understand the thought and to come to terms with the author. But if we're reading someone from the distant past, a lot of times it's going to be kind of difficult because not only maybe we're reading a translation out of the author's original language, but he may not even have the vocabulary that we have today in order to express the thoughts and ideas that we are trying to come to terms with. One example is empathy. I was doing some research on empathy, and empathy didn't even enter into the English language until around 1905, the early 1900s. So if you read something like Adam Smith's work, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, a lot of what he is writing about is empathy, or what we call today empathy, even though he never uses that word. The reason being, when he wrote the work, that word was not in use. It wasn't translated from German into English again until the 1900s, and his work was written before that. So sometimes it could take a little bit of work to come to terms with authors written in the distant past because, again, they may use words differently than we use them today. Not impossible, it takes a little bit of work, but as you read and you gain the context and you find that the author's using these special words and with special emphasis, you can identify those words and start the work to really get to the thought and idea behind them. So this kind of gives us a little bit of a clue as to the important words that an author is using. Sometimes when a word or a thought or a term or a phrase is giving us trouble, you can kind of bet that it's probably important to the author. So that's where we really need to stop and begin the work of coming to terms with the author, is finding those trouble spots in the work and putting in the work to understand them and again, come to terms. Now sometimes we're dealing with technical words or special vocabularies, and so you can kind of determine what words and phrases are important by them just not being ordinary to you. So if you're learning calculus and you learn take a differential, and you may not understand the word differential and it may be foreign to you, but that gives you an indication that maybe a differential is something that you need to learn about because it's not ordinary to you. You need to come to the point where you do understand it and elevate your level of understanding to encompass that word and all that it means into your knowledge. And so another thing that we can do is find which words and phrases that an author is putting special emphasis on, what words come up continually, and what sentences are hinged upon the expression of a particular word. Again, differentials and calculus is a very important part of it. It's describing the equations that relate to curved space. Now, that's an important part of calculus. So you'll see differential come up over and over again, and many of the other equations refer back to it. So you can tell that this is a specific word that you want to focus on, and make sure you understand it, because your understanding of the whole thing kind of hinges on your understanding of a couple of words and their definitions, because everything is going to build from there. So that's how you can kind of deal with special vocabularies and special terms. One of the hallmarks of a non-demanding and a non-analytical reader is his inattention to words and his consequent failure to come to terms with an author. And this is what we're trying to avoid. We don't want to just breeze through a work, get to the end, and having no elevation in our understanding and having gained no knowledge. We want to finish a work and we want to have grown. Whether we are growing from the acquisition of knowledge that we agree with, or growing in our understanding of our opinions by reading something that we don't necessarily agree with, we then at least have a greater understanding of the other side, and maybe have a deeper understanding of what we do in fact agree with. So, working on finding the meaning. So once you have marked the words that are giving you trouble, there's going to be just one of two things. The author is either going to be using this same word to mean the same thing throughout the entire work, or he's going to be using that word to mean many different things throughout the entire work. He may not even use that word again. It's still important to grow your vocabulary and look at the words you don't understand, but it's especially important to understand the words that the author is using over and over again to mean one single thing, because that in fact is what is a term. That's when a word becomes a term, when it's used to mean one thing throughout an entire work. Now occasionally an author will use a word many different times, many different things, but you'll find throughout the work that there's a reason that the meaning of the word changes. So it's important to read the context and read what's happening around a specific word and see how this word or this idea evolves as the author uses it continually throughout the work. That's an important thing, is making sure that if the author's ideas are evolving, his terms may also be evolving, and you want to make sure you catch that. If you come across a word that you do not understand, it's important to put it in the context of all the words that you do understand, and this will help you discover the meaning. So that's one problem. The other problem that we discover is synonyms, and so that's kind of a separate problem for a separate time. And the last one we have is the use of phrases. So sometimes you'll have you have words that are packaged together where a whole sentence may now describe a single thought, and so you want to make sure that you keep an eye out for that as well. So your comprehension of any book will be enormously grown if you go through the trouble of identifying the important words, coming to terms with their meaning, and therefore coming to terms with the author. And this concludes my thoughts on Chapter 8. Now we begin with Chapter 9, Determining an Author's Message. So a proposition is also a declaration. It's an author's judgment, his affirmation of something that he says is true, and his denunciation of something that he believes is false. Now, all of this declaring and all of these propositions is simply his opinion unless they are supported by reasons. So we're building up from the smaller units up to more complex units. Now, A book consists of words, but it doesn't just consist of words. You take words and you group them together and they form phrases, and those phrases come together to make propositions, and those propositions, when put together, they form arguments. An active reader is attentive not only to the words, but also the sentences and the paragraphs. There's really no other way to come to terms with an author's terms, his sentences, his propositions, and his arguments. So the two processes of outlining and interpretation meet on the level of propositions and arguments. As you're beginning to outline a book, you're going to outline it from a high-level perspective, from arguments down to propositions. And as you're interpreting a book, you're going to be working up from words to terms to propositions, forming from the different sentences, the different paragraphs taken together to make sure that you understand those propositions and move into the level of argument. So as you meet in the middle where these two processes coincide, you're coming to a deeper understanding of the author's message in what the book is about. So now we move into dealing with sentences versus propositions. Now, it would be a mistake to think that there's a one-to-one relationship between the use of words and thought as well, because sentences and words are grammatical units and propositions and arguments are logical units. Specifically, propositions and arguments are units of thoughts and knowledge. You can think of propositions as answers to questions. Now, so long as sentences and words and terms remain unanalyzed, they actually are barriers instead of mediums for communications. So it's important that you break these things down to come to an understanding, to come to terms, so that you can understand the propositions or the answers to the questions that we've outlined in the previous parts. You do not want to simply read words, because the goal here is to receive knowledge. So this moves into two new rules. Rule number 6 is to mark the most important sentences in a work and find the propositions they contain. And rule number 7 is to find those group of propositions and understand the argument that those propositions make up by finding them in relation to one another. From the author's point of view, the most important sentences are the ones where he is affirming or denying, expressing his opinion on some matter. But not just those, he's also going to have sections where he is expressing his thoughts and opinions and reasons for supporting or denying a particular thought or idea. And it's important that you discover these sentences and really kind of see them in high relief to the surrounding sentences. You should be understanding how important it is to be perplexed. If you're confused in a book, that can be a good thing, because that means that you're entering into a new realm of knowledge. And it's important to understand that wonder is an important aspect of learning, not only from books, but also from nature. It's important that you find yourself awed and maybe a little bit confused, but also deeply interested in what the author is having to say, because you can dig in and really find yourself growing when you find these difficult passages and you're wading through this area of new knowledge. The human mind is naturally sensitive to propositions and arguments, just as an eye is to color. But just as you will not be able to determine a color if your eye is not open, you will not be able to follow these propositions and arguments if your mind is not awake. Most ineffective readers only pause over the passages that interest them and skim over the ones that puzzle them. But we want to pause over both. We want to pause and read through and work through not only the sentences that interest us or the passages that interest us, but also the ones that puzzle us, because that is where we're able to grow. So we want to find the propositions, because a key component of Rule 6 is understanding the propositions that each argument contains. And this basically boils down to just understanding what the sentence means. Again, some of these things are going to sound complex, they're going to sound very difficult, but again, understanding a proposition is simply understanding what the sentence the author is using means. There's really only two main differences from understanding the terms that words express and the propositions that sentences express. The first is when you're understanding the propositions that sentences express, you're using a larger context. You use all the surrounding sentences and bring them to bear on the particular sentence that contains the proposition. Just as when you're interpreting the terms, when you're using the words, you're using the surrounding words to find the meaning of that one specific word and whether or not it's a term that the author is using. In both cases, you're proceeding from a level of not understanding to a level of understanding. from a level of unintelligibility to that of making the work intelligible. The other difference lies in the fact that most of the times complex sentences can express more than one proposition. Stating a proposition in our own words is the best test to make sure that we understand what an author is saying. If the best you can do is simply repeat the words that the author used in stating his proposition when asked if you understand it and to say it in your own words, you can bet that you don't really understand what the author is saying. In other words, if I say, hey, what's the author mean by this? You simply just repeat back to me word for word, verbatim what the author said. You really don't understand it. You're really just parroting back words. You're not giving me your understanding. If you can't get away from the author's words, all it indicates is that words have passed from him to you and not knowledge. You know his words, but you do not know his mind. What the author is trying to communicate is knowledge and not necessarily words. So if all you can do is state it in his words and not your words, then all you've received is vocabulary basically and not knowledge, which is the goal of reading. Now, the translation of one English sentence into another is not simply changing the words. Your translation into another sentence must also be faithful to the original thought. And this is important because it's important to understand that if an author's idea is given to you in different words, it's important for you to be able to recognize the thought. Now, this is specifically important when you're reading syntopically because you may have two different authors state the same idea or thought using different words. And it's important for you to be able to understand that they're expressing the same thought even though they're not using the same words. Another great test to make sure that you're understanding the author's arguments and propositions is there a relevant case in your life, an experience that you've had that either affirms or denies the author's statement. This is often just as good as stating the argument in different words. It's important to understand that arguments and propositions must relate to the real world that we live in. We're not simply dealing with words and imaginations when we're dealing with expository works. It's important that we're able to relate what we're reading to our life and the world that we're living in. He talks about the vice of verbalism, which I see a lot of today, and that's simply using words without regard to the thoughts and ideas which they should convey and the experiences that are relevant to them. Often are people misciting ideas, misciting thoughts, misciting history, using words and terms in relation to things that they have nothing to do with. And this is a very sad state, honestly, and that's part of the motivation for this channel is for people to understand thoughts and ideas and terms and use them accurately and understand when someone else is not using them accurately, because we don't want to be duped and we don't want to be deceived by someone just throwing around a bunch of fancy words. We want to come to terms with what they're saying and be able to refute or accept and assimilate what a person is saying. So again, we want to go through this rigorous work of understanding what the thoughts and ideas are of a work and going through the rigorous process of putting them to the test for whether or not they are valid or invalid, and also putting to the test our thoughts and our ideas that we hold in doing that for others as well. He says this verbalism and not being trained in grammar and logic leads to a slavery to words and not a mastery over them. And I think that's a very powerful thought. So we come to the section on finding arguments, and that brings us to rule number 7, which is to find the paragraphs which construct the main argument of the book. And if they aren't plainly expressed, it's our job, unfortunately, to go through the work, find those sentences which compose the main arguments, put them all together so that we can have the main arguments of the book spelled out due to our own work. Now, some books which are poorly written don't have these arguments plainly spelled out, and some of them even skip steps in the argument or skip propositions entirely. Sometimes these omissions can be misleading, and sometimes they can even be meant to be misleading. One of the tricks of orators is to leave certain things unsaid, and this could be because if they were said and made explicit, they could be challenged on them, and they do not want to be challenged on them. So it's important for us as readers, it's important for you as a person to be able to identify arguments, to identify the propositions which are important to an argument, and know if one has been missing, and know how to challenge on what information should be included that's not, so that you are not misled when you're reading a work or hearing an argument. It's a sound maxim of careful reading to make sure that every proposition is included and made explicit. It's important to understand that every argument is going to be made up of several statements. If you find the conclusion first, then look for the reasons that support that conclusion. If you find the reasons first, follow those reasons and see where they lead. They should lead to a conclusion. Secondly, make sure that you're able to discriminate between arguments based on a couple of facts that lead to a general statement versus general statements which lead to a generalization. The former kind of reasoning is called inductive, and the latter is called deductive. But it's not necessarily important what they're called, even though it would be nice for you to know that the names for the specific types of reasoning, but it is important to understand that there is a discrimination between the two. In the third place, it's important to understand what the author says must be assumed. He's going to say certain things are self-evident or certain things are general knowledge, and it's important that you can come to the conclusion as whether or not they can actually be assumed or whether or not maybe there's some faulty logic there in making those specific assumptions. Now there's two ways that can start. One is the agreement of generalizations and what can be assumed by the reader and the author, and the other are self-evident propositions, and there are some of those. But these self-evident propositions are indemonstrable, but also undeniable facts that you can agree on without necessarily having to be taken through a long proof. They're based on common experience and common knowledge alone and don't necessarily belong to any body of work. Next we move into finding solutions and to Rule 8. Now, before, one of the important parts of outlining and understanding and interpreting a book is to understand the major questions that the author is trying to answer or the problems he is trying to solve. Now, Rule 8 is to find out what those solutions are. Now we have the second stage of analytical reading, which is what is being said in detail and how. Now he has a great quote that I would like to read here because I think it sums up these rules and the idea that we're trying to communicate very well. He says, when you have come to terms with the author, found his key propositions and arguments, and identified his solutions of the problems that he faced, you will know what he is saying in his book, and you are thus prepared to go on to ask the final two basic questions about it, and we're going to get to those next week. This concludes my thoughts on Chapter 9. Now next week we're going to go over chapters 10, 11, and 12. I know it's 3 chapters, but they're not very long. They're a little bit shorter. That's also going to allow us to complete part 2 of the book and move into part 3 the following week. I'm very excited to move into part 3. It's going to get into a lot of detail about how to read specific types of works, and it's really what we've been working to. It's how to read analytically different genres, and it's going to be great. It's going to be a great launching pad for us to move into our first work that we're going to read together. That's not of this nature. It's going to help us understand and interpret the great books that we're going to be reading together, and I'm very excited about it. So don't forget, we're going to have the meeting this coming Saturday at 10 a.m. It's going to be a lot of fun. We've had great meetings in the past. Don't forget to share these videos with your friends. If you have someone that you think would benefit from them and would like to read along with you, go ahead and share them, because again, people can go back and watch from video number 1 and watch all the way through everything that we've learned. They can even go through the past videos just to catch up with where we are now. Just don't forget to share and bring and spread this community and bring other people up to speed with us. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I hope to see you this coming Saturday. And thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next video.